Welcome to the world of science fiction where extraordinary tales come to life. Enjoy the journey. The twin suns of Xanthia Prime burned crimson as Cal Varick, Earth's youngest diplomatic envoy, stepped onto the landing platform. His boots crunched against the crystalline soil, and he squinted at the alien skyline. Towers of shimmering obsidian spiraled like frozen flames. "Welcome, human Kale," boomed High Prelate Draven, his azure skin pulsing with bioluminescent patterns. "Your arrival honors us." Kale bowed, sweat trickling down his neck. The briefing files hadn't prepared him for Xanthia's gravity. Twice Earth's, making every movement feel like wading through syrup. "The honor is mine, Prelate. Earth seeks friendship with Xanthia." A murmur rippled through the crowd of robed dignitaries. Then the sea of blue-skinned aliens parted, and she appeared. Princess Leora was unlike the others. Her skin wasn't azure, but a deep violet, her hair a cascade of liquid silver. She wore a sheer gown that shimmered like starlight, and her eyes, golden, slit-pupilled, locked onto Kale with predatory curiosity. "You're warmer than I expected," she said, circling him. Her fingers brushed his wrist, and Kale shivered. Xanthians ran cooler than humans, but her touch sent electricity up his spine. Draven chuckled. "My daughter studies alien biology. Forgive her bluntness." Kale forced a smile. "No offense taken." Reaching into his pack, he pulled out a crumpled foil-wrapped bar. "A gift from Earth. Chocolate. A cultural delicacy." Leora snatched it before Draven could object. "You eat this." She peeled the foil, nostrils flaring at the rich aroma. "Yep. Try it." The moment the chocolate touched her tongue, the crowd gasped. Leora's pupils dilated, her skin flashing radiant pink. A chorus of chitters erupted, Xanthian laughter. Draven's face paled to gray. "Human Kale, do you know what you've done?" Kale blinked. "Shared a snack." "By our oldest law," Draven whispered, "offering sustenance to a royal is a marriage proposal." And she accepted. Leora licked her lips, eyes gleaming. Numb, delicious, and binding. The platform erupted in cheers. Cal's stomach dropped. This wasn't in the mission brief. The arena pulsed with the rhythmic chanting of the crowd, their voices rising like a storm. Kale stood at the center, the weight of his ceremonial armor pressing down on his shoulders. The Xanthians had dressed him in their traditional combat garb, a sleek, form-fitting suit of metallic blue scales that shimmered under the twin suns. It was lighter than Earth's military gear, but the gravity still made every movement feel sluggish. Across from him, Lord Kraith flexed his clawed fingers, his cobalt skin rippling with anticipation. He was taller than Kale, broader, his muscles coiled like springs. His golden eyes gleamed with amusement. "First blood, human," he hissed, twirling a curved blade. "Or do your kind fear pain?" Kale exhaled slowly, adjusting his grip on the dagger they'd given him. The weapon was unfamiliar. Its edge glowed faintly, humming with some kind of energy. He had no idea if it was ceremonial or lethal, but Kraith's grin suggested he wasn't planning on holding back. The High Prelate's voice boomed across the arena. "Let the trial of strength commence." Kraith lunged without hesitation, his blade slicing the air where Kale's throat had been a second before. Kale barely dodged, rolling to the side as the crowd roared. His muscles burned. Xanthia's gravity was unforgiving. Xanthians favor wide, sweeping strikes. Leora's voice whispered in his earpiece. She wasn't allowed to interfere directly, but she had slipped him the comm device before the trial. "They rely on intimidation. Don't let him corner you." Kale gritted his teeth. Kraith came at him again, this time feinting left before slashing downward. Kale barely raised his dagger in time, the clash of metal sending sparks flying. The impact rattled his bones. "You fight like a child," Kraith sneered, circling him. "Humans are weak, fragile." Kale didn't answer. He was too busy analyzing Kraith's movements. The Xanthian was strong, but he telegraphed his attacks, Every swing was preceded by a slight shift in his stance. The next time Krith charged, Kale ducked low, sweeping his leg out in a move he'd learned in basic training. Krith stumbled, caught off guard by the sudden shift in tactics. Kale didn't hesitate. He drove his dagger forward, aiming for the soft spot between Krith's armored plates. The blade grazed Krith's thigh, drawing a thin line of iridescent blood. The arena fell silent. Then, like a dam breaking, the crowd erupted. Kale stepped back, chest heaving. Krith touched the wound, his expression shifting from shock to fury. "Lucky strike," he spat. But the prelate's voice cut through the noise. "First blood has been drawn. The human passes the trial of strength." Krith's snarl was venomous, but he sheathed his blade and stalked away. Kale exhaled, his muscles trembling with exhaustion. Leora's voice crackled in his ear. "Well done. But the trial of wisdom is next, and it won't be as straightforward." The second trial took place in the Hall of Echoes, a vast chamber where whispers carried for miles. Kale stood before the Council of Ancients, 7 elder Zenthians whose skin had faded to near-translucent white with age. Their eyes, milky and sightless, seemed to stare straight through him. The eldest, a withered figure named Vera, spoke first. "Human, you seek to bind yourself to our bloodline. But do you understand what that means?" Kale swallowed. "I'm learning." Vera's lips curled. "Then answer this. What is the greatest weakness of your kind?" The question was a trap. If he answered honestly, he risked giving them leverage. If he lied, they'd know. Kale chose his words carefully. "Our greatest weakness is also our strength. We feel too much. Love, anger, fear. It drives us, but it can also destroy us." The elders exchanged glances. Then Vera nodded. "And what would you sacrifice for this union?" Kale didn't hesitate. "Everything but my honor." A murmur rippled through the council. Vera leaned forward. "You speak well, human. But words are wind. The final trial will test your truth." That night, Kale found himself standing at the edge of the Ember Pools, a sacred site where Zenthian couples completed their bonding. The water glowed faintly, swirling with bioluminescent algae. Lyora stood beside him, her violet skin shimmering in the dim light. "The trial of devotion," she said softly. "We enter the waters. If our spirits are compatible, the pool will react." Kale frowned. "React how?" She didn't answer. Instead, she stepped into the pool, her gown dissolving into the water as if made of mist. Kale followed. The moment he submerged, heat flooded his veins, not the scorching burn of pain, but something deeper. A connection. He gasped as sensations that weren't his own flickered through his mind. Leora's memories, her emotions, her fear of this alliance failing. And then, something stranger. The water around them began to pulse, shifting from blue to a vibrant gold. Lyra's eyes widened. This has never happened before." Kale reached for her, his fingers brushing hers. The moment they touched, the pool erupted in light, a beacon shooting into the night sky. The crowd gathered at the pool's edge fell to their knees. Even the prelate looked stunned. Lyra's voice was barely a whisper. "Kale, what are you?" The golden light from the ember pools faded slowly, leaving the night air charged with something Kale couldn't name. His skin still tingled where Leora had touched him, and her emotions lingered in his mind like echoes, sharp curiosity, simmering defiance, and beneath it all, a flicker of fear. The crowd at the pool's edge remained kneeling, their whispers hushed and reverent. Even High Prelate Draven looked shaken, his usually composed face slack with disbelief. "This changes things," he murmured, more to himself than anyone else. Kale waded out of the water, his clothes clinging heavily. Lyora followed, her silver hair plastered to her back, her golden eyes locked onto him with unsettling intensity. "You felt it too," she said, not a question. "Yeah." His voice came out hoarse. "It was like Like our thoughts were the same for a moment, she finished. She reached for his hand again, experimentally, and the second their fingers brushed, a jolt of warmth shot up Kel's arm. The crowd gasped. Drevin stepped forward, his voice cutting through the murmurs. The trial of devotion is complete. The bond is undeniable. He hesitated, then added, but there will be discussions. This has never happened with an offworlder before. Kale didn't miss the way Lord Krith's face darkened at the words, or how the faction of blue-robed elders at the back of the crowd exchanged sharp glances. The feast that followed was a blur of exotic dishes and wary stares. Kale picked at a plate of something that resembled glowing jelly, his mind still reeling. Lyora sat beside him, close enough that their arms brushed, her presence a constant hum in his senses. "You're not eating," she observed. "Not really hungry," he admitted, still processing the whole sharing my soul with an alien princess thing. She smirked, plucking a morsel from his plate. "You humans are so dramatic." It was barely a glimpse. "Barely a Lyora, I felt your 5th birthday party. The one where you cried because your pet glowmite flew away." Her smirk vanished. "You saw that." "Vividly." She groaned, dropping her face into her hands. "That's worse than the bonding ceremony." Kale laughed, the sound startlingly loud in the tense hall. A few heads turned their way, some curious, others openly hostile. Lord Krith stood abruptly from his seat farther down the table. "Prelate," he called, his voice dripping with false courtesy. "Surely we should hear more of our guest's world. If he is to be one of us, let him prove he understands our ways." Drevin sighed, as if this were an old argument. Kale has already passed the trials. Krith. "But tradition states the betrothed must share a drink from the chalice of unity," Krith pressed, gesturing to an ornate silver cup being carried forward by a servant, to symbolize the blending of their paths. Kale tensed. Something about the way Krith was watching him set off alarms. Lyora's fingers tightened around his wrist under the table. "Don't," she whispered, so low only he could hear. "The chalice is real, but that's not wine." Cal's pulse spiked. He leaned in as if to kiss her cheek, murmuring against her skin, "Poison. A neural blocker. It would sever our empathic link before it fully forms." Across the table, Krith's smile grew sharper. "Well, human, or are Earth's customs too fragile for our traditions?" The room waited. Kale reached for the chalice, then deliberately knocked it over with his elbow. Dark liquid splashed across the stone floor, hissing faintly where it touched the metal serving trays. "Oops," he said flatly. "Clumsy me." Krith's composure cracked. "You." "Enough." Drevin stood, his voice like cracking ice. "The human has honored our ways. Krith, you dishonor yours with these games." The hall fell silent. Krith's fists clenched, but he bowed stiffly and stormed out, his followers close behind. Later, in the privacy of Lyora's chambers, Kale finally let himself breathe. "Okay, what the hell was that?" Lyora paced, her bare feet silent on the polished floor. "Krith has allies in the High Council. They've never wanted an alliance with Earth. They think your people are unpredictable, dangerous, and the poison would have made our bond seem like a fluke, a trick of the pools." She stopped, her voice dropping. "They'd have had grounds to annul the marriage." Kale ran a hand through his hair. "So what now? I can't dodge every poisoned cup they throw at me." Lyora turned to him, her eyes burning. "We don't dodge. We strike first." A thrill shot down Kel's spine, half alarm, half admiration. "You're suggesting we out-scheme your political rivals." She bared her teeth in something too sharp to be a smile. "I'm suggesting we remind them why humans and Zenthians are a very bad pair to cross." Outside the window, the twin moons cast long shadows across the palace spires. Somewhere in the darkness, their enemies were plotting. And for the first time, Kale realized, he was looking forward to the fight. The air in the palace archives was thick with the scent of aged parchment and ozone from the flickering data terminals. Kale squinted at the holographic records floating before him, the glowing Zenthian script shifting as Leora swiped through centuries of political alliances and betrayals. "They won't try poison again," she muttered, fingers dancing across the console. "Krith's too smart for that. But he will target our weakest point." Kale rubbed his temple, still adjusting to the lingering hum of their empathic link. "Which is?" She turned to him, golden eyes sharp. "You." A cold knot formed in his stomach. Leora pulled up a security feed, Krith speaking in hushed tones with a hooded figure in the palace gardens. "He's petitioned the High Council to invoke the right of challenge," she said, "an ancient law allowing a contested union to be decided by combat. To the death." Cal's laugh was dry. "Of course he did. It's a ploy. He knows Earth's envoys are forbidden from lethal engagements." She paused. "But if you refuse, the Council could nullify our bond." The weight of it settled over him. His mission, the fragile peace between their worlds, all hinged on a fight he wasn't allowed to win. Kale exhaled sharply. "There's another option." Leora went still. "Zenthian law permits champions to fight in place of the betrothed." He continued, recalling the archives they'd scoured. "But the champion must share blood with one of the bonded." Her pupils dilated. "You're suggesting I fight Krith? You're the only one who can." He reached for her hand, their fingers interlacing with an electric hum. "And we both know you've been waiting for an excuse." A slow, feral grin spread across her face. The challenge circle was carved into the oldest tier of the palace, its obsidian floor stained with centuries of ceremonial bloodshed. The entire High Council stood in silent judgment as Krith strode into the arena, his cobalt skin oiled for combat, twin daggers glinting in the harsh sunlight. He froze when he saw Leora waiting for him. "This is a farce," he spat. "The human sends his bride to die for him." Leora rolled her shoulders, the lightweight battle harness she wore leaving her arms bare. "Oh, Krith," she purred, unsheathing her own blades, curved, serrated things that caught the light like broken glass. "You always did talk too much." The gong sounded. Krith moved first, a blur of blue muscle and steel. Leora met him mid-charge, their weapons clashing in a shower of sparks. The crowd roared as they broke apart, circling. Kale watched from the edge of the circle, his pulse hammering. Through their bond, he felt it. Leora's focus, her calculated rage. She wasn't just fighting to win. She was teaching. Krith lunged again. Leora twisted, her blade scoring a deep line across his ribs. He snarled, swinging wildly, but she danced back, fluid as shadow. "Pathetic," she taunted. "All these years, and you still fight like a child swinging sticks." Krith's composure shattered. He attacked in a frenzy, leaving openings a novice could exploit. Leora took them all. A slash to his thigh, a stab to his shoulder, each wound precise, non-lethal. Humiliating. When he finally collapsed to his knees, gasping, she pressed her blade to his throat. "Yield." The arena held its breath. Krith's eyes burned with hatred. "Never." Leora leaned down, her voice a whisper only he could hear. "Then bleed for your pride." Her blade flicked out, nicking his carotid, just enough to send a trickle of iridescent blood down his chest. The High Prelate stood. "The challenge is met. The union stands." That night, Kale found Leora on the palace's highest balcony, her silhouette framed by the swirling auroras of Zenthia's upper atmosphere. "You didn't kill him," he said. She didn't turn. "I wanted to." "I know." He felt the echo of her fury through their bond, dark and hot. Leora finally looked at him, her golden eyes reflecting the starlight. "But you wouldn't have wanted me to." Kale stepped closer, their shoulders brushing. "Would that have stopped you?" A pause. Then, quietly, "Yes." The admission hung between them, heavier than any weapon. Kale reached for her hand, twining their fingers together. The empathic surge was instant, her exhaustion, his relief, the tangled mess of their shared stubbornness. Somewhere below, The palace was already buzzing with whispers of the princess, who fought like a storm, and the human who tamed her. They had no idea. The emergency transmission from Earth Command crackled through Kale's comm unit, shattering the fragile peace of the past week. Admiral Riker's face flickered on the holo display, his voice tight with urgency. Hostile forces have breached the Vega outpost. We need every available ship to reinforce the sector immediately. Cal's stomach dropped. Vega was Earth's last defensive line before the core colonies. If it fell... Lyora's fingers dug into his shoulder as she leaned over the display. What forces? Riker hesitated. Scouts report Cynthian signatures. The air left Cal's lungs. Across the bond, he felt Lyora's shock mirror his own. That's impossible, she snapped. Our fleet hasn't. Not your official fleet, Riker cut in grimly. Rebel factions. Ships marked with Krith's insignia. The pieces clicked together with terrible clarity. Krith's humiliating defeat hadn't ended his ambitions. It had redirected them. Kale was already moving, grabbing his field kit. We'll mobilize within the hour. Riker's gaze flicked to Lyora. With all due respect, Commander, this is a human security matter. Cynthian involvement is non-negotiable. Lyora's voice could have frozen stars. That bastard is using my people's tech to attack yours. That makes it my fight. The Admiral exhaled sharply. Then you have 12 hours. After that, Earth's counterattack won't discriminate between rebel ships and royal ones. The transmission cut out, leaving silence thick enough to choke on. The hangar bay seethed with activity as crews prepped the only ship fast enough to reach Vega in time. Krith's own battle cruiser, seized after the duel. Its obsidian hull gleamed under the work lights, the rebel insignia barely scraped from its flanks. Kel double-checked his plasma rifle's charge. You're sure this thing will fly? Lyora ran a hand along the ship's prow, her palm leaving faint bioluminescent streaks on the dark metal. Oh, she'll fly. A predatory grin flashed across her face. And she'll bite. They boarded to find the interior stripped of Krith's personal banners, but still reeking of his arrogance. The command chairs upholstered in rare beast hides, the weapons locker stocked with enough firepower to level a city. Kale slid into the pilot's seat, fingers flying across the alien controls. The ship's systems responded sluggishly at first, then with growing confidence as Lyora fed him commands through their bond. Ready? He asked, as the engines roared to life. Lyora strapped into the gunnery station, her eyes reflecting the tactical displays. Let's go collect our traitor. The ship screamed into the sky, leaving Zenthia's atmosphere in a streak of violet flame. Vega Outpost hung broken against the stars, its orbital defenses pockmarked with plasma burns. Krith's fleet moved among the wreckage like sharks. 8 sleek destroyers herding the surviving human defenders toward the station's crippled core. Bastards trying to trap them, Kale muttered, rerouting power to the thrusters. Lyora's fingers danced across her console. Then we'll spring the trap early. Their stolen ship plunged into the fray without warning, its forward cannons blasting apart a rebel fighter before the enemy could react. Chaos erupted across the comm channels as Krith's forces scrambled to identify the new threat. A familiar voice crackled over the speakers. You. Krith's snarl was unmistakable. I should have spaced you when I had the chance. Lyora opened a visual link. Krith's face filled the screen, his once pristine uniform now singed at the edges. Surrender, she said simply. Or burn. His laughter was acid. You brought one ship against my fleet. Even for you. That's. The explosion lit up space behind him as Earth's reinforcements dropped out of warp. 6 heavy cruisers flanked by a swarm of fighters. Kale bared his teeth. Actually, we brought friends. The battle erupted in earnest. Krith's ships wheeled to meet the new threat, their formation fracturing under the sudden pincer attack. Kale wove through the chaos, his ship's agility letting him dart where the larger vessels couldn't follow. Got a lock on Krith's flagship, Lyora reported. He's trying to flee. Kale banked hard. Not today. Their ship arrowed through a hail of enemy fire, shields screaming under the assault. Alarms blared as a plasma burst scorched their port side, but Kale held course. Now, Leora fired. The torpedoes streaked across the void and punched through Krith's engines in a blossom of white-hot debris. Silence fell across the battlefield as the rebel flagship listed, dead in space. The aftermath was a blur of damage reports and prisoner transfers. Krith survived, pulled from his ruined bridge by Earth Marines. He spat at Leora's feet when they dragged him past. "Traitor to your own blood," he hissed. She backhanded him hard enough to split his lip. "I chose my family." Her golden eyes flicked to Kale. "He just happens to be human." Admiral Riker found them later in the outpost's medbay, where Kale was getting his burns treated. "Earth won't forget this," he said quietly. "You both risked everything." Leora squeezed Cal's hand as the bond thrummed between them. "We gained more than we risked." Outside the viewport, the stars burned steady and bright. Somewhere among them, Zenthia waited, and for the first time, Kale realized he was thinking of it as home. The return to Zenthia was nothing like their departure. Instead of secrecy and urgency, their arrival was met with a full honor guard, warriors in gleaming silver armor lining the path from the landing platform to the High Council chambers. The air hummed with tension, thick enough to taste. Kale walked beside Leora, his boots echoing on the crystalline floors. "They don't look happy," he murmured. She didn't glance at him, her posture rigid. "They're not." The council chambers were packed. Every noble, every elder, every military officer of note stood in silent rows, their expressions ranging from curiosity to outright hostility. High Prelate Draven sat at the center of the raised dais, his face unreadable. To his left, the War Masters. To his right, the scholars. And directly before them, in chains, knelt Krith. Draven stood, and the room fell utterly silent. "Krith of House Vale," he intoned, "you stand accused of treason against the crown, conspiracy with rebel factions, and the unlawful assault on a sovereign human outpost. How do you plead?" Krith lifted his head, his golden eyes burning with defiance. "I plead duty," he spat. "Duty to Zenthia, to pure Zenthia. Not this abomination you would let fester." His gaze flicked to Kale and Leora, lip curling. "You would let our bloodline be tainted by them." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Leora stepped forward before Kale could react. "You speak of purity," she said, her voice like frozen steel, "yet you spilled Zenthian blood alongside human lives. You are no patriot. You are a coward." Krith lunged against his restraints, teeth bared. "And you are a fool. That human has blinded you." "Enough." Draven's voice cracked like a whip. He turned to Kale. "Commander Varric, Earth has demanded justice. What say you?" Every eye in the room fixed on him. Kale exhaled slowly. "Earth doesn't seek vengeance," he said. "Only assurance this won't happen again." Draven studied him. "And if we cannot give that assurance?" Kale met his gaze. "Then I'll personally ensure no Zenthian ship threatens our borders again." A beat of silence. Then, to Kale's shock, Draven smiled. "Well said." He turned back to Krith. "You will face execution at dawn." Krith paled. "You can't." "I can." Draven's voice was final. "And I do." Part 7. A New Dawn. The bonding ceremony took place at sunrise, in the same ember pools where their connection had first ignited. This time, there were no trials, no tricks, only Kale and Leora standing waist-deep in the glowing waters, their hands clasped as the High Prelate recited the ancient vows. When the final words were spoken, Draven pressed a ceremonial blade into their joined palms. "Now," he said quietly, "finish it." Kale didn't hesitate. He drew the blade across their linked hands, their blood mingling in the water. The pool erupted in gold light once more, but this time it didn't fade. It pulsed, radiating outward in waves, illuminating the entire cavern in shimmering brilliance. Through the bond, Kale felt it. Leora's joy, her fear, her unwavering resolve. And beneath it all, something deeper, something neither could name. Draven bowed his head. It is done. As they stepped from the pool, the crowd erupted in cheers, not just from Zenthians, but from the human delegation that had arrived overnight. Admiral Riker stood at the forefront, offering a crisp salute. Leora leaned into Kale, her voice barely audible over the noise. No going back now, human. Kale grinned, tangling his fingers with hers. Wouldn't dream of it. Above them, the twin suns rose higher, casting their light across a world and a future neither had ever imagined.